Today, we're going to explore the Empress ZOIA Euroburo, or ZEBU. I made 10 factory presets of the 60 that are loaded on the unit, 3 of which are synths, 3 of which are effects, and 4 of which are utilities. We'll start with the synths. First up is DigiOp, which is a 4-voice FM synth that accepts both CV and gate inputs, as well as MIDI, so you can play with an external keyboard. It has a FM pulse wave modulation input, as well as a clock, which routes an internal LFO source that moves a flanger around. So it has a 4-stage ADSR up at the top, where you could dial in your attack, decay, sustain, and release, as well as a bandpass filter. Right, so it's right now I have it set in the middle position. The filter is modulated by the ADSR that's triggered by the gate input. Each voice also has a diffuser or all-pass reverb filter thing, which is defined by the size. So larger size is going to be a longer reverb decay, and smaller is going to be shorter, more abrupt room kind of sounds. Then there's a feedback, which controls the gain of the diffuser. In this case, if you go all the way up to 1, then it's going to basically add a distortion layer. Then there's a external level control, so you can route an external input through the effects. Right, that includes the filter, the diffuser. Then there's an FM, right, so the operators are arranged in a way that causes modulation across the oscillators for their FM inputs. So you control the, right, this is an attenuator basically for the amount of FM. Then there's a modulation on the diffuser, which controls sort of the width of the samples being processed. And then finally, a flanger mix. Right, so the internal, there's 4 sine waves that are modulating this flanger, which we can see here on the scope. So that's the sine wave being used to modulate the flanger. And you control the mix on the front panel. There's also a tap tempo, which will be overridden if you have a constant gate source coming in from the clock input. But if I take that out, then the tap tempo will be used, or you could just use a constant gate. As far as outputs, we've got the sine combined LFO. We have a inverted stepped version of that sine LFO. And then we have the ADSR output. Right, so I turned off the volume here, but you could just see when I press a pad, right, which is triggering the gate source, we see the ADSR go up through its stages. Then we've got 2 inputs. Again, those are for the FX units. So stereo inputs to those, and then stereo outs. Pretty straightforward. Some tips, like I said, if you want an additional distortion layer, you could turn up the feedback. that's DigiOp. Next is DZO, or Dual ZOIA Oscillator. Same idea, it's a FM synth, but instead of polyphony, we have two-note paraphony, meaning that you have stacked oscillators, but they play the same note. So what's interesting here is you can change the wave shape for both. So in the top left and right, we have the wave selection, right? So it's sine, square, saw, triangle for both sides. There's an overall quantizer for setting your key and scale. There's two ADSRs for each operator. There is a global low-pass filter, a global reverb decay, a global FM offset range, as well as individual offsets for the two voices. And what's interesting here is there's a FM source control, right? So it's internally routed so that they modulate each other to create FM, but you can change that to exclusively use the inputs, right? So input 1 goes to operator 1's FM input, and input 2 goes to operator 2's FM input. And you can change it so that way more to the right on each of these will cause the input to affect the FM, and more to the left means that the internal source will create the FM. So for inputs, we have pitch and gate, same as the previous. We have a FM, which is actually the offset amount for the ratios. So if we plug in an LFO, it's controlling both ratios at the same time. There's also a clock input, similar to the previous, as well as a tap tempo. This clock only really controls one thing. It's the internal LFO, which is a triangle. And you could toggle that off by pressing this button. Then it won't output anything. Just an extra LFO to use in your rack. We also have the clock output, right? So it's either relaying what's coming on the input, or it's just spitting out the tap tempo. And then there's the quantized pitch out. Let me take out these. Right, so it's going to, so we see at the input, it's taking in about 1.9 volts. And spitting out 1.833. So it's quantizing that pitch down to what's in that, in this case, C minor scale. I talked about the inputs. Again, we have FM A, which affects operator A, FM B, operator B, and then the combined outputs. So let's play around with some of the FM. So I hooked up the QPOS ping, the low-pass output, into FM A. Right, so we'll hear that, the effect of that FM going in. We can also use a pure noise source like the Wogglebug. It's a little loud. just for all your weird noises for those FM inputs. Next, we'll move to the final synth, which is called NARCC, or Not Another Rings Clouds Clone. There's no emulation here. It's there's no like mutable code. It's just I programmed up a pinged filter rings kind of synth into a clouds kind of reverb. Cool. Right, so this one's a little different because there's no actual synth. There's no oscillators. It's all based on pinged filters. Right, so there's 3 bandpass filters that are being pinged whenever it gets a gate input. And they're offset so that their frequencies are different amounts. So it gives off this sort of like chord almost. All right, so we have pitch and gate inputs, just like the other two. We have an external mod input, which affects the vibrato. There's a vibrato in here. Which can kind of give off an FM kind of vibe. And there's a clock, which is used for the... so the Clouds engine is 2 reverse loopers running alternating, plus which are pitch shifted, plus a long played reverb, basically. As far as outputs, we've got the looper cycle, which is just the clock output, basically, because it's using an LFO to alternate the record playback. We have the ADSR, similar to the previous one, which is showing the whatever the gate signal plus the ADSR settings. And we've got the modulation, which is actually a combination of the internal mod source plus the external. Right, so it includes the ADSR plus the external source. And you control, there's an attenuverter for the external input. right? So you can control how much of it affects the modulation for the vibrato. As far as controls, we have ADSR up at the top, like normal. You've got a resonance control, which controls the amount of resonance in the filters. You want to keep it high so that way the filters really ring out. We've got a feedback, which is accidentally mislabeled. It should be a volume for the clouds, reverb, pitch shifting side. If you leave that down towards 0, you're not going to hear any of the looper section, basically. There's a bandpass filter, again, on the cloud side. There's a noise level, which is subtle, but it uses the noise source for the pinged filter. It actually increases the VCA being opened by the ADSR just a little bit to add a little more sort of like just kind of an extra. That's the word I'm thinking of. It just adds more noise. It has an external level for going through the clouds section, right, which is accessed by the inputs. There's a mod depth, which affects how much of the modulation is affecting the vibrato. External mod amount, I said that's an attenuverter for the external mod input. Loop pitch, right? So this is the looper side, how much you want to pitch shift. The looper, have it set to 1 octave. It goes up to 2 and down to 2. -2, sorry. And then finally, there's a reverb mix for how much of the plate reverb you want active. Right, so that's it for the synths. We'll go to the effects. And for the effects, I need an input, so I'm going to use Morphogene, some samples, mostly drum samples. Okay, that's kind of cool. So basically the keyboard is controlling the position of the sample. I set to a certain grain amount, and it's going through our effects. All right, the first effect is called Fragments, which is a granular delay reverse thing with pitch shifting and modulation. All right, so we've got a blend control, which is a mix, a density amount, which controls the density of the grains that are being played back, in this case, out of 8. The more density, the smoother it is going to be. Then we've got a size parameter, which is controlling the grain size. Similar to what we're doing in the Morphogene, we're shortening the sample length. And if you get down low enough, then it turns into an oscillated tone. Then we've got texture, which is it's a little bit of a subtle control. Basically, it's controlling the volume relative levels inside the granular engine. So this is a good candidate for modulation. So I've hooked it up to one of the inputs. Then we've got a position parameter, which controls the position of the sample in which the playback starts to happen. So there's actually a little bit of a delay. All right. So if we go down to 0, it'll start processing immediately. Then we've got a feedback delay, so it goes through a feedback loop, so you can control the delay of that, as well as an overall feedback amount. Then there's a bandpass filter, a pitch control for offsetting the pitch of the granular, a freeze indicator, so if you hit this button, it's going to freeze the buffer and just keep whatever's in there. Then we've got a vibrato amount. This controls the modulation depth of a stereo spread vibrato. A random depth, which randomly changes the position of the sample that's being played back. A tap tempo, which actually is tappable. And then a 2 indicator nodes. There's gran and loop. So this patch is really interesting because it has 2 modes. It has the granular mode and the reverse mode. The reverse mode is cool because it has 2 offsetting reversing loopers that have the same sort of set of controls except for 2 things. So the differences here is there's no density, doesn't affect anything for the looper, and neither does the freeze. Everything else has a control. The size is the size of the loop length. The texture is there's a volume attenuator here. And then pitch affects the pitch of the looper, and then the feedback position is the position in which the looper starts processing. Everything else is the same except for density and freeze. Those don't have an analog for the looper side. As far as inputs, we've got stereo inputs, stereo outputs. We've got a size or chop, which affects, again, the loop length or the sample length. Pitch for either the pitch of the granular or the looper. The texture, which is basically a volume sort of AM modulation. Clock input for controlling the speed of the LFOs as well as the looper record. We've got a random LFO, which is being used for modulating the position. Right, so that has an analog here. Slewed random, which is that same random LFO but smoother. And then a looper cycle or a clock out. and I spent a lot of time, but that's Fragments. Next up is 3011, which is based on a multi-tap reverb delay thing. We'll change our sample. So 3011 is a weird sort of filtered reverb thing. It has 6 delay taps. It has a feedback. It has high and low pass filters. Basically, it sounds like you're putting your audio through some sort of lo-fi device. So we've got space, which controls the offset for the delay taps. It goes all the way down to like basically 0 and all the way up to like 300-ish milliseconds. A mix for the dry wet. Feedback for the feedback loop on the delay taps. Modulation depth, modulation rate, high pass and low pass, as well as a external modulation in for the vibrato. There's attenuverters for the delay input and an attenuator for the feedback input. So the lower you go on the space control, the more sort of artifacts and grunginess you're going to hear. The LFO is also pretty unique here. It's a triangle mixed with an exponential decay, and it goes directly to the delay times. This basically wouldn't have been possible without the linear delay lines that was added recently. For the outputs, we've got the combined LFO, which is that unique LFO I was talking about. So if we turn up the depth, sort of see that. We've got the triangle by itself. And we've got the, let's see, a random inverted, which I believe is built from those two, but not used in the overall FO, just used for an output. Pretty cool patch. Next up is called spin cycle, and we'll change the sample again. So this one's kind of interesting. It's the similar idea where you have alternating loopers, as I did in Fragments and in NARCC. But instead of using it for sort of, well, there is pitch shifting, but the idea is we can sort of scan through that loop buffer and then have direct control over aliasing, as well as just adding a bunch of noise to it. The best way to demonstrate this is to plug in an LFO into the scan parameter. Basically, the idea is the higher you go on the delay or the lower you go on the alias frequency, the more noise you're going to get, bit crushing, and basically signal dropout. It kind of works like a clock almost, with like different sample rates on it. So we've got a tap tempo for the looper, as well as a clock input. We've got a speed parameter for adjusting the speed of the loopers. The scan, which again scans through the buffer based on the looped length, right? So it's really short here. We've got a random LFO output. The envelope, right? So it's taking the envelope follower from the input and spitting that out as CV. We have inverted envelope. And then a clock output. Stereo ins and outs. We've got a feedback parameter for the feedback of the delays. Delay time affects basically how fast things are going to repeat. And actually what's interesting here is the lower, the longer you go, the more degraded you get, which I guess makes sense. A speed attenuverter for the speed input. Bandpass, which is really a bell, so just for accentuating specific frequencies in the delayed signal. A mix control, speed for adjusting it from the panel. Modulation. This one's kind of subtle, but again, I really like vibrato, so that's in there. Alias frequency, again, that's for adjusting the frequency for that noise source. And then loop length for shrinking or lengthening the looper cycle. Cool. All right, the last four are utilities, but they also have effects as well. The first one's called Arithmetic, which is kind of based on maths. But there are some compromises because audio signals are audio and CV signals are CV for ZOIA. But yeah, it's basically math. The inputs, channel 2 and channel 3. In this case, since if you plug in a source, if you plug in a cable, an audio cable, they will turn into envelope followers. So that way you get the envelope of the signal on the output. So I'm just monitoring channel 2. Same thing for 3. Right, so what's interesting is that these function as both, it's a sort of a way to get audio to CV conversion working with the mixer. If something's plugged in and the value is above 0 for the audio signal, then these two function as attenuverters for that envelope signal going into the mixer. If there's nothing plugged in, then they function just as offsets for the mixer. Right, so we see 3.4, right, which is the sum of 0.5 minus half of 18. Right, they're offset to 10 and 5 volts. So that part I thought was pretty interesting to include. We've also got toggles on the top to say which signals go into the mixer, which is this output. So if I do all 4, then I'm going to get just these offsets. And then we have cycle buttons for the envelopes. Right, so now channel 4 is making an LFO go. So we can turn off these 3. And we just see the effects of that envelope. And the mixer always accounts for the attenuverter's value. There's dedicated outputs for function 1 and function 2, which are raw, no attenuverting on them. It's just whatever the envelope is being used for. All right, so then we've got a couple other utilities here. We've got a mixer switch. There's 3 positions. There's sum, inverted, and average, which takes the average of the 4 signals. Then there's a clock toggle. There's a clock output for whenever the end of rise, end of cycle happens. Right, it's basically producing a trigger. You can change that from end of rise to end of cycle by pressing this. So the thing about the end of cycle is that they're both channel 1 and 4 are assigned to this. So you need to have both of them on for it to sort of work. So that's why end of rise is the default. Then for inputs, we have channel 1 and channel 4. These are, what's the word? Something to know about ZOIA is there's a clock filter for when you want noiseless gate inputs. So if you're pinging ADSR, you want to include a clock filter on that input. That's the best way to do it. So since these are going into ADSRs, they have clock filters on them. So basically, whenever a clock source goes in, it triggers the envelope. And then we have controls. These two are identical, right? So channel 1 and channel 4 are identical. Then we have controls for rise, fall, and shape. Right, similar to what you find on maths. The shape goes from log to linear to exponential on both sides. There's a both input for what you'd expect on maths. It decreases both the rise and fall at the same time. And then a shape input for adjusting the shape on the fly without needing to change the parameter. All right, so let's just listen to what it sounds like, because there's some audio as well being used here. So channels 2 and 3 go through a lot of audio circuits, actually. There's an audio multiply. There's all three types of bit crushers and bit modulators. And then it's all mixed and sent to the stereo outputs. So you can just have a sort of a raw signal by keeping one of the inputs below 0 for the attenuverter, and one above. Right, because these control actually the VCA for the signals going into those audio multiplications. But you can get Rigmon pretty easily if you turn them both up. Right, so this is what it sounds like when you turn it off. Right, just a nice sort of ring mod you can apply. Yeah, it's a pretty handy utility module with all these different sort of outputs. It's pretty cool. Next up is Not My Tempo, based on the movie Whiplash, as well as kind of a tempi, kind of. It's a clock source. It's got 4 clock outputs, as well as controls for the 4 clocks. And it's not just gate signals. It could be either triangle or sine, as well as a square wave. And you can mix the shape between them, similar to how you could on the Arithmetic. The effect here is a tremolo. I just thought it would be cool. It takes the amount of the LFOs and subtracts from the, based on the trem depth control, subtracts the volume, basically. Yeah, so since they're all identical, I'll just focus on one. So we have 6 controls. There's 2 toggles and 4 knobs per clock. The first one is the mute. So in the corners are the mutes. So if you mute a clock, then it's not going to be output. There's also a shift, which we'll get into in a little bit. Again, another toggle. Then there's the shape. In this case, the output is triangle. Yep. A phase, which offsets the phase from the master clock source. A multiplication. So they're all on clock divider, so you can nudge it up by multiplying or nudge it down by dividing. And this is where the shift comes in. So the shift function, which is triggered either by pressing the shift button or sending a gate to the shift input, will swap the multiplication and division for that particular clock, or whatever clock has the shift active for. All right, so let's send a gate signal into the shift input, and we should see these drastically change. Yep, so they're speeding up because they're swapping the multiplication and division for that clock divider. There's a tap tempo for adjusting the master clock source, as well as a clock input. And then a CV control for adjusting the tempo manually with some CV input. And there's an attenuverter for that adjustment. Something I find interesting is when you take one of the outputs and plug it into the CV, it'll gradually get slower, right? Because, well, depending on what you have the attenuverter set to. So since it's sending a negative CV to the tempo and it's using one of the sources for that, gradually the clock will get slower and slower over time. And then finally, there's a reset phase for if they get out of sync. There's like 20 different times that the CV gets converted to tap and clock sources. So that's just a way to just make sure that they're in sync if you have like 4 square waves going at the same time, something like that. Next up is called Professor Chaos, which is a chaotic LFO based on a patch I released a while ago for the ZOIA. There are actually 4 different chaotic attractors included in here with the CV math pages, and you can go into the details on the, looking at those individual pages. But basically, it's a chaotic source for CV or a weird granular effect module. So stereo inputs and outputs, we've got the 4 parameters. So there's the function on X, the function on Y, the function on Z, and then the sum of those functions from the chaotic math. We've got a freeze for the granular. So if you just want to freeze it at whatever it's at and then have it modulate internally. And then a mode selector, right? So that's changing the function between 4 different toggles. Basically, there's a lot of difference between them, but for usability purposes, the first one is a two-axis system, so it's only an output X and Y. The rest of them are 3-axis, so they'll have a Z component as well. And then also the blue function has an envelope follower, so it'll take the envelope of the signal coming in and use that for some of the modulation. A lot of these are basically stereo width effects because this is a panner. Let's see, there's a tap tempo as well as a clock input. Then there's 3 parameter inputs, so each system has up to 3 parameters that it affects. So there's input controls as well as panel controls for those. Basically setting initial conditions that you can change over time. There's the function button, right? So you see what it's toggling. We've got wet and dry controls. We've got the clock, and then a chaos LFO amounts. So the speed is a control that is a manual adjustment of the tempo, right? The tempo will override if you set a new tempo. So if I adjust this down and then set a tempo, it'll map to that tempo. There you go. This chaos depth, I left it at 0.1 because that's somewhat chaotic without being total use, whatever. If you dial it back down to 0, then they're basically going to be sine waves, because that's what everything starts as. But if you toggle it like all the way up, then it just kind of like, can you see it on the screen? Yeah, then it's just randomness. So I left it at that 0.1 value for somewhat chaotic, but not too crazy. Yeah. And then last but not least is Noisy Bug. Which is it's a little bit of a hodgepodge of things. It's a utility. It's got white and pink noise outputs. It's got a sample and hold trigger and source. And it has a CV looper. All right, so if we plug something into the noise VCAs, we have a attenuator for both white and pink noise. White's on the left, pink on the right. Pink is a little more interesting because it has a aliaser. Otherwise, the unique thing here is the sample and hold and how it interacts with the noise sources. So we could take a trigger, right? So a gate source. And a source, right? Some CV signal. Right, it's some modulating value. Every time that the trigger hits, then it's going to sample that signal. And then there's a slewed function for a smoother rate of change for the sample and hold. Then lastly, there's a CV looper. So it's recording. Where it captured some snippet of that CV recording from the sample and holds and the inputs. The inputs are an envelope, so that it'll contribute toward the sample and hold output. So we can capture some longer amount of things, turns into a sort of a shift register or Turing machine type of thing, which is interesting. And then lastly, there's a trigger output, which just mirrors the trigger it gets for the input for the sample and hold to tell it when to start affecting things. The audio that comes in doesn't actually end up coming out unless you specifically mix it in, and it's only on the pink noise because it's using the aliaser to sort of define a pinkish frequency. It's not perfect, but it's just a sort of a unique noise source. Then, as I said before, there's attenuators for the noises. There's the aliaser frequency for pink, and there's a loop speed, which defines how quickly the CV looper plays back. It's a cool little patch. It's a nice utility. To finish up, those are my 10 factory presets for the ZOIA. I'll add a bonus for 2 patches that I just posted on Patch Storage yesterday. So you can read the full notes, but we have a port of Glamour Years and a port of Abyss Water. So aside from some minor changes to the routing, mostly the changes are in the CV section. So again, Glamour Years is an attempt to create a pre-years in ZOIA/Eurorack. It's basically 4 gain stages with a filter insert and a bias sort of sagging filter. Some notable additions here are obviously the CV inputs. We've got a bias. For increasing the amount of sag. Right, no sag. So it adds noise, basically. We've got a resonance, which interfaces with the filter. Sorry, the frequency, which interfaces with the filter. Then we've got gain 2 and 3 inputs. Basically acts as a tremolo. And then for outputs, we've got the envelope. Right, the strength of the input envelope, as well as inverted. And then a trig output, which sends a CV pulse whenever I toggle the filter. Also, since I didn't talk about this in the Glamour Years update video, you can only select one filter at a time, but you can easily move around and it'll automatically turn off the other ones. This was just to avoid feedback loops. And you can also toggle the filter types and the FM types here or down here. And then Abyss Water is a low-pass gate modulator vibrato. Very similar to the ZOIA patch. The additions are an external input in, noise source, and obviously the CV. So let's listen to the noise. Right, so this toggles the noise presence in the circuit, and then you have a VCA to add to it. Normally it's defined that the input envelope will open up the noise VCA as long as it's active. Then we have a resonance input. To open up the resonance for the low-pass filter. A mix. Right, so you can use this to cycle between wet and dry, as well as just adjusting the control. And then a external mod input, which mixes with the internal modulation source for the vibrato. And then for outputs, we have an envelope, or filter mod, the inverted version, and then the delayed modulation. So this is mixed with the external source at the outputs. So whatever's coming in here will be reflected for the delay mod and the delay mod inverted version. Otherwise, it's a fine-ish. It's a random LFO that is slewed. So yeah, that is it for my ZOIA mega video thing. Thanks for watching. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you later. Bye.